What's up guys, hope you're all doing okay today, fit, well and healthy. I just thought I'd do a quick video to address the news that's come out today from the World Motorsport Council, where they have approved a number of changes, first of all to the governance of the way that the FIA rules the sport, but also to some of the regulations that will affect both 2020 and 2021. Some of them are headline news, so we'll address some of those, but the overall meeting was something that had been scheduled for a while, lots of things on the agenda. The biggest thing and the reason the meeting was happening right now was because the FIA, quite rightly, wanted to put in place some measures to change the wording of their own regulations that will allow them to be a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more proactive in making changes that can deal with the ongoing global health pandemic that we're all kind of suffering under at the moment, and is changing so rapidly. We all know that Formula One's governance, particularly Formula One's, we're talking about the FIA here, but specifically when it comes to Formula One, is so overcomplicated and takes such a long time to get things like unanimous agreement from all teams to make decisions and make changes like this. Well, today's meeting, or today's news rather, was to outline the fact that those regulations have been updated to allow those changes to happen much more easily. That all seems very sensible to me. So they can make changes to the calendar now without having to get unanimous approval. They can make changes to the regulations as well, again without having to get the entire grid to agree to sign them all off, which can be time consuming. What they have done is put a bit more power into the hands of the FIA to make those decisions, and then we as fans and the stakeholders in Formula One have to trust that they are doing the right thing in these ever-changing and unprecedented circumstances for our sport. So, given all of that, one thing it does do, in fact it specifically states in here that the president of the FIA, Jean Todt, will gain extra powers to make these kind of decisions. Now, many of you know my views on Jean Todt. He's not top of my Christmas card list for a number of reasons. So to give him extra power, particularly given what's happened in recent months with some of his decision making, I guess some people will question that, but we've got to trust at this moment that given what's going on in the world, these are the right decisions, and they are things that will enable us to deal with the ever-changing situation more quickly and hopefully more efficiently. So that's all one thing. The next thing that we need to address is one of the things that was changed in the wording of the regulations in the 2022 regulations. So that was the 2021 car that's now been pushed back to 2022. What we now know is that the budget cap that was all due to come in at the same time as those regulations, the budget cap now still comes in January of 2021, so ahead of the 2021 season. The 2021 cars, or the new cars if you like, will not come in until 2022. Now that is great, because that means that the development for those cars happens under the constraints of a budget cap. And that for me is a great thing, because it sort of levels the playing field a little bit. It means that when we get to 2022 and we get this big, wow moment of here's the new Formula One, we know that everybody's had to develop under more or less the same kind of financial restrictions, so that's all great. But there was always going to be a question mark as to how much development could be done right now during 2020 before that budget cap came in. And of course the big teams would have had a massive advantage in being able to split their workforce, split their resources onto putting a large chunk of people onto 2022. Particularly now, whilst there's nothing happening in 2020 right now, there could have been so much work happening on the 2022 car, development work, aero work. Well, today that's been specifically banned. So as of the 28th of March, that's the 28th of March just gone, no aerodynamic development was allowed, or is allowed to take place on what will be the 2022 cars during the rest of 2020. Great rule, I really like it. I think it makes a lot of sense, it's sensible to do, and I think ties in nicely with the fact that the 2022 cars should be now developed under the restriction of the financial budget cap. I've already had loads of questions on Instagram of people saying, well, how on earth can they police this? The truth is, it's very difficult to police something like this. It relies on an awful lot of self-policing. And typically what happens is, teams have to submit logs to the FIA of what, of their wind tunnel usage. That happens anyway. But there's nothing stopping them fudging those, there's nothing stopping them getting around that. And the truth is that if anybody wants to get around this regulation, they probably can. The thing that stops people typically bending the rules to some extent, and obviously it happens, it's happened all the way through history, the thing that will keep this in check is the risk or the fear of them getting found out, because the consequences of breaching this regulation would be severe. And it only takes one person to leave the team and go to another team and mention it in conversation before there could be an investigation, and therefore somebody could get busted. So I feel like everyone's on the same page right now. Everyone feels that this is probably a sensible idea, and that will probably look after itself. The next one that crops up in this press release from the FIA is that DAS, the dual axis steering system that Mercedes have developed for this year, for 2020, and was due to be on the car for the Australian Grand Prix, well, we're carrying these regulations more or less into 2021. So the same cars that were due to race in 2020 will now race in 2021. But as of this press release, the DAS system will no longer be allowed in the cars in 2021. And again, loads of questions on Instagram and Twitter already of people saying, well, hang on, does that mean they can still use it in 2020? What happened, the biggest change here is that for 2021, so this is the carryover of this year's cars, now specifically written into the regulations is some wording banning the use of a DAS type system. In the current regulations that are governing 2020 that we're under right now and would have covered the Australian Grand Prix, there is no such wording. Now that doesn't necessarily mean there's a line between it being legal now and illegal next year. Incidentally, that same wording appears in the 2022 regulations, so it won't be allowed then either. The difference is that right now, in the 2020 season, if we were racing, if we'd had the Australian Grand Prix, there's nothing specifically outlawing it in the regulations. Mercedes could have operated it in the Australian Grand Prix. What was most likely to happen then is somebody may well have decided they wanted to protest it. Red Bull had already talked about that. The decision would then be put in the hands of the race stewards at the Australian Grand Prix to decide whether they think the system breached any of the wording of the current technical regulations. Now that would have probably centred around things like adjustments to steering, suspension while the car's out on track, or does it constitute a movable aerodynamic device? Those kind of things would be the thing that maybe the stewards could deem, if they see that way, that it might have been illegal. But there's nothing specifically outlawing it in the regulations, and that's the big difference between now and what will be the regulations covering next year. Now the next question is, what happens to Mercedes? Because their car has been designed with it. We're carrying those cars into next season. Do they have to redesign their chassis? I don't think they will, no. They'll take the system off the car and probably just replace it with a standard steering rack and standard column mechanism that they would have had as an option anyway. So I don't see it being a major drama. It's not something that the entire car design or concept is centred or focused around. Obviously they think DAS gives them an advantage, so if they get to use it this year, and that's a big if we go racing in 2020, they may well decide to use it, but they'll still be under that constant threat of a protest if they were to use it during the 2020 season. And then it's in the hands of the stewards, as I say, so nobody knows. Maybe they'll decide not to risk using it if we go racing in 2020 and just take it off the car anyway, given that it's such a short-term gain, but with this big risk attached to it. So the point is that Mercedes will have spent time and money, invested time and money in developing this system, which we now know for sure will not be able to be used beyond any races we might get in 2020. Someone asked me earlier, what happens if they merge the 2020 and the 2021 regulations? What happens if they merge that into one super season? Good question, and I don't think anyone knows the answer to that, other than to say that I think that's a highly unlikely scenario, and we're much more likely to either write 2020 off and go for a standard 2021 season, or we'll get enough races in 2020, even if they happen to be shoehorned into a shorter space of time, to call this a season and then run 2021 as a separate championship. So I don't see that being a major issue. Now I know for loads of you, and I've already had a lot of this on social media, of people saying, why on earth are they doing this? Why are they banning stuff like this? F1's supposed to be about innovation. And I 100% agree with you on many levels of this. And under normal circumstances, for me, I'd be saying, let's just let them go with it. You know, DAS is a brilliant invention. I'm really you know, it's one of those things that I'm proud to be associated with Formula One, when some brilliant engineer comes up with a system like that, that's simple yet has so many potential advantages. So why are we banning it? Well, the main reason, and particularly why this has been done right now, is on cost grounds. And this is why lots of these restrictions are coming in, particularly for 2021, is because teams are going to suffer financially throughout 2020. Less races, yes, they save some money in terms of flights and hotels and that kind of thing, but they're taking an awful lot less in. Less races means there's less money in the prize pot, less to divide out amongst the teams. They are all going to take a serious financial hit throughout the course of this year. So all of these rules, like carrying the cars over, like freezing development, like banning DAS, is to stop all the other teams having to try and desperately scrabble around in their factories to develop their own system that might bring them up to speed with whatever advantage they think Mercedes might have. So I think it's a sensible move. I understand why they've done it. That's why it's been done in this particular time frame. And whilst I would really love to see Formula One open up its technical regulations and just let the budget cap be the thing that governs how and where we spend our money, maybe that's going to have to wait for a few years a bit further down the line once the whole thing's settled down a little bit. So there you go. I hope that makes some sense of the news that might have come out today. A couple of other little tweaks in there as well, but those are the headline grabbers. Those are the things that I thought would be most interesting to you. Just quickly, a couple of things on power unit usage. They have specifically worded for the 2020 season a number of races that mean that change the number of power units that teams will be allowed. So for example, 14 down to 12 races will mean that the teams get 2 of everything from the power unit list to be able to operate, so that's obviously less than they would for a full season. And then there's another change when it gets to, if it's as low as 11 races or below, they lose a couple of things like the ERS components, go down to 1 unit. So a couple of changes like that, all very sensible. The main headlines really are the banning of aerodynamic development on the 2022 cars throughout 2020, and the banning specifically of dual axis steering systems for the 2021 season. Hope that makes sense. Stay well, stay safe, look after each other guys, and I'll see you soon. Ta-da.